Hello everyone and welcome to our module on cardiac anatomy. Let's start by reviewing the major chambers of the heart. Blood enters the right atrium of the heart via one of two structures. The first is the superior vena cava, which drains blood from above the heart. The other is the inferior vena cava, which drains blood from below the heart. From the right atrium, blood moves into the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle, it is pumped out via the pulmonary artery and into the lungs. After blood moves through the lungs, it enters the left atrium of the heart via one of four pulmonary veins. You can find the entrance to the pulmonary veins in the left atrium. From the left atrium, blood moves into the left ventricle, and from there it is pumped into the aorta. Notice also in this picture that the walls of the left ventricle are drawn and they are thicker than the walls of the right ventricle. That is the same thing you see in the anatomy lab. The reason the walls of the left ventricle are thicker than the right ventricle is because the left ventricle has to generate much higher pressures in order to pump blood to the entire body. The right ventricle does not need to generate such high pressures, therefore it has thinner walls and less muscle. There are four valves found in the heart. The tricuspid valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The pulmonic valve is located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. The mitral valve is found between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And finally, the aortic valve is found between the left ventricle and the aorta. All of these valves have three cusps or leaflets except for the mitral valve, which has two leaflets. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Shown on the screen is a cardiac MRI image from a patient of mine, and I've shown you this to demonstrate the anterior-posterior relationship of structures inside the chest, including the heart and great vessels. So to help orient you, this is a cross-section through the chest. The black areas on the sides are the lungs, and in the middle of the picture is the heart and the aorta. Contrast material has been injected into the vascular system so that blood appears white. So in the front of the chest, we have a structure that is holding blood, and that is the right ventricle. Notice that it's an anterior structure. The right ventricle is anterior to other parts of the heart, and therefore it's often injured in penetrating trauma that goes through the chest wall, though other structures can also be damaged as well. Behind the right ventricle, there's another structure holding blood, and that is the left ventricle. Notice that the left ventricle is surrounded by these walls, which are relatively thick. Notice also that the right ventricle has walls that are thinner, just like we talked about on the last picture. This structure in the back of the chest that I'm circling with my pen is the left atrium. Notice that the left atrium sits right on top of this black hole here. That black hole is the esophagus, and it sits just behind the left atrium. Behind the esophagus, you find another circular structure that contains blood, and that is the aorta. So it's helpful to remember that the esophagus sits between the left atrium and the aorta. This will help you understand why cardiologists like me sometimes take pictures of the heart by inserting a probe in the esophagus. That test is called a transesophageal echocardiogram, and the reason we do this is because the esophagus is right next to the left atrium and the aorta. It's also very close to the mitral valve right here, so we can get very close-up pictures of these structures if we place an ultrasound probe in the esophagus. You should also be aware that if the left atrium becomes massively dilated, it can potentially compress the esophagus and cause dysphagia. This is rare, but it sometimes occurs in cases of severe mitral stenosis, and they'd like you to understand for your boards what can be affected if the left atrium becomes massively dilated. And now that you've seen this picture, hopefully this will help you remember that the esophagus is right next to the left atrium. Let's talk about the coronary arteries. If we look at the picture on the screen, this red structure here that I'm drawing a line through with my pen is the aorta. Coming off of the aorta are two vessels that supply blood to the heart. The first one is called the left main coronary artery. It bifurcates into two vessels, the LAD, the left anterior descending coronary artery, and the left circumflex coronary artery. The LAD artery supplies blood to the anterior wall of the left ventricle. The left circumflex supplies blood to the lateral wall of the left ventricle. Also coming off of the aorta is the right coronary artery. It supplies blood to the right ventricle and then wraps around the side of the heart and goes underneath. The posterior descending artery is not shown in this picture, but it supplies blood to the inferior wall of the left ventricle. In about 90% of people, the PDA is a branch of the right coronary artery, and we call those people right dominant. In 10% of people, the PDA is a branch of the left circumflex, and we call those people left dominant. Venous blood that drains away from the myocardium goes into a structure called the coronary sinus, not shown on this picture. The coronary sinus drains into the right atrium, just like lots of other venous blood, and you're sometimes asked on board exams, what could cause a dilated or enlarged coronary sinus? And the answer is anything that raises the pressure in the right atrium, because the coronary sinus drains blood into the right atrium. If the pressure is high in the right atrium, the coronary sinus can become enlarged. When you hear people talking about myocardial infarctions, they'll often say that a patient had an anterior wall myocardial infarction or an inferior wall or a lateral wall myocardial infarction. And what they're referring to when they use those terms are the walls of the left ventricle. When people have heart attacks, we want to know which walls of the left ventricle are involved. And it's important for you as a medical student to understand which blood vessels supply which walls of the left ventricle. So let's talk about that now. These are the coronary artery territories supplied by each vessel. So the anterior wall, the anterior septum between the ventricles, and the apex of the left ventricle is all supplied by the left anterior descending artery. And this is easy to remember because the artery has the word anterior in its name. The lateral wall of the left ventricle is supplied by the left circumflex, and I used to remember this by just thinking of the vessel as the lateral circumflex instead of the left circumflex. Use that if you wish. And then finally, the inferior wall and the inferior septum between the left and right ventricle are supplied by the PDA. And as I told you on the last slide, in 90% of patients, the PDA comes off the right coronary artery. The other 10% of people are called left dominant. In these patients, the left circumflex supplies the PDA. And in terms of myocardial infarctions, the LAD is the artery that is most commonly infarcted. The circumflex is the least likely to be infarcted, and the RCA is in the middle. And I talk about all this in more detail in the modules on ischemia. Let's talk about the mitral valve. The mitral valve has two leaflets, an anterior leaflet and a posterior leaflet. And the leaflets are tethered to two papillary muscles by structures called chordae tendineae, which I'm circling in this picture. The two papillary muscles are the anterior lateral papillary muscle and the posterior medial papillary muscle. Some people just call them the anterior and the posterior papillary muscles. And one thing that's high yield for you to know about these two papillary muscles is that the anterior lateral papillary muscle usually has a dual blood supply from both the LAD and the circumflex. This makes it relatively resistant to ischemia because, for example, if you had an infarction in the left circumflex artery, the anterior lateral papillary muscle would still get blood from the LAD. The posterior medial papillary muscle, on the other hand, often has a single blood supply, usually from the right coronary artery or sometimes from the circumflex. What this means is that the posterior medial papillary muscle is more vulnerable to ischemia and can potentially rupture in the setting of a myocardial infarction. In the ischemia modules, I talk about the fact that one of the dangerous consequences of myocardial infarction is for a papillary muscle to rupture. The patient will develop severe mitral regurgitation and acute heart failure, and this is often a fatal event. The papillary muscle that often ruptures is the posterior medial papillary muscle. This often occurs in the setting of an inferior wall myocardial infarction, and the reason it's the posterior medial papillary muscle that usually ruptures is because it has a single blood supply in most cases. I'll finish by reviewing the anatomy of the cardiac electrical system. So electrical activity through the heart is generated under normal circumstances by the SA node, which is found on the lateral wall of the right atrium. From the SA node, electrical activity goes through both atria, but it can only reach the ventricle by going through the AV node. The AV node is found on the interatrial septum. This is the wall between the left and right atria. From the AV node, electrical activity travels through the His bundle, and then the right bundle branch and the left bundle branch, and finally it travels to the Purkinje fibers. The His bundle is located on the interventricular septum. This is the wall between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And in general, the SA and AV node are usually supplied by branches of the right coronary artery. And that concludes our module on cardiac anatomy.